So the concept of climate justice universities is kind of an imaginary university, right? It's thinking about what if higher education institutions, which I think are actually more powerful and more central to society than we think. We often think of universities as, places to go get some credentials for your job, and obviously there's research going on, but we don't think of universities as necessarily like really critical social infrastructure in discourse and policy and how we think about our place in society. So first of all, the idea is that acknowledging that higher education is really important, right? Like what goes on and what doesn't go on in our universities kind of it really is influential and impactful to policy and politics and society and culture in so many ways. So, but climate justice universities is kind of taking this climate justice for me is a paradigm shift. It's not thinking about climate in the traditional ways we have with greenhouse gas emission reductions and the carbon footprint and that kind of thing. I mean, that's a part of it, but it's much more thinking about the climate crisis as a symptom of a bigger systemic structural challenge that we have in how our social and political and economic systems are perpetuating and kind of concentrating wealth and power. So what I tried to do in the book is leave the critique, the negative parts of, what's going on in universities just to chapter 2 and kind of the rest of the book is really trying to open up our imagination about what we could be doing. What if our universities were really well publicly funded so that they weren't captured by private interests and wealthy donors and corporate multinational companies? And what if they instead were, dedicated to creating and imagining and working toward a better future for everyone, more healthy, more stable, more equitable, um, and that's kind of the way I tried to frame the discussion. So there's a lot in the book that people would say, oh, that will never happen, or and what I tried to do also is say the book isn't a how-to guide, right, of what to do in universities. There are no current universities that I would call climate justice universities, right? Like this, it's an imaginary, and it's trying to, and I think we don't have enough of that in our universities, right? It's about rigid knowledge frameworks. We have to learn this, we have to learn this. But like we're in such a disruptive time. I think we really need to break some of that traditional, conventional, narrow ways of thinking and think more creatively about the future.
I was going to say that actually. Sounds to us that universities and just humanity in general can sometimes there's a lack of curiosity, right? And it's this reimagining. What if we could create a better way and things better for society, better for our communities? Because right now, I mean, we've seen it a lot. We have partnerships with universities. We have clients as universities. So we can see some of the challenges, but we're quite lucky that we're not deep within academia, so to speak, because we do and can leverage our privilege, so to speak. But we notice that quite often, if you're working inside as faculty, you're almost gagged. And that's what your points are at sometimes, that because of the way universities are funded sometimes, or who the donors are, and I'm sure we'll unpack this later. And again, I don't want to pick on just the US because it's happening all over Europe as well. Maybe we could start with something I was really curious about in your book was radical acts of resistance. Can you just give us an example of one of those?
Sure. So I think I within the book I talk about kind of resist, reclaim, and restructure, trying to like thinking about getting to climate justice universities, a different way of thinking about higher education. And in terms of the resistance part, in these complicated institutions and infrastructures that we're all part of, you can't be always resisting everything, right? Because then you wouldn't fit within the institution. So, but the idea of radical acts of resistance are to recognize when there are opportunities to actually say, no, this isn't, what I want to be doing. This isn't the way, this isn't, doesn't align with what I think universities should be doing. So, I mean, I think some examples of that are, resisting the what I call, and others have written about, academic capture, which is, for example, with the climate crisis, the fossil fuel industry has been strategically investing in higher education for decades to promote fossil fuel friendly technologies, policies, and to kind of normalize, oh, of course, we all need fossil fuels. There's no way to move away from them because look, we are all using them and this kind of thing. And so one act of resistance that I've tried to do is not take money or be on projects that have fossil fuel interests involved with. But it's difficult because a lot of universities have fossil fuel executives on their boards, or they, fund student scholarships, which are all things, which the university is incentivized to accept and promote. And so, there's no absolutes, I think, in terms of how, especially for people within higher education institutions, to resist. But there are opportunities, I think, and different people in different times in their career, students try to hold their universities accountable with protests and um, and faculty and staff and other higher education leaders choose other ways, and mechanisms of when to kind of take a stance and try to resist something that's happening. So it's very context specific in terms of how and when people have an opportunity to resist. But I think we're at a time where if we don't acknowledge that there needs to be some resistance, we are just perpetuating and exacerbating the problems, and we're not holding ourselves accountable. And I think accountability and open inquiry about why we're doing this, how much funding are we getting from here or there, or what influence are those actors having on our priorities in the institution or in the sector. I think it's really important to be asking these questions, but it's not always easy because there's powerful
Yeah.
interests who don't want us to ask some of these questions.